Flight 236 shook violently as passengers panicked in terror. Radio chatter filled the air. F-22 approaching. Identify your call sign. The co-pilot trembled. Captain is unconscious. We have no call sign. A blonde woman in a gray blazer stood up from business class. She walked into the cockpit, her voice deep and steady. Falcon One, checking in. Outside, the F-22 pilot went silent. A name thought lost since Black Dawn had just returned. Catherine Hale sat quietly in seat 4A of the business class cabin. 34 years old with shoulder-length blonde hair that caught the cabin lighting and gray-blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing despite their apparent disinterest in her surroundings. She wore the uniform of corporate success. A navy blue silk blouse, a perfectly tailored gray blazer, black dress pants, and low heels that suggested someone who valued both professionalism and practicality. To her fellow passengers, she appeared to be exactly what her boarding documents indicated, a cold, calculating executive who preferred silence over small talk and efficiency over friendship. Other travelers whispered among themselves about the intimidating woman in business class. She's probably some ice-cold CEO. Look at that expression, like she owns the world. Catherine remained silent throughout these observations, sipping her water, reviewing documents with methodical precision, and occasionally checking an expensive mechanical watch that seemed oddly robust for someone in corporate finance. What the passengers didn't know was that Catherine was far more than she appeared. She was a former F-16 test pilot who had earned the call sign Falcon One during classified operations, including the notorious Black Dawn mission that had officially never happened. She had been forced out of the military due to political disagreements with senior command, disagreements that had cost her a career she had dedicated her life to building. Now she worked as a civilian aviation consultant, providing technical expertise to defense contractors and airlines while carefully hiding the depth of her operational experience. Flight 236 was carrying more than routine passengers. Several high-ranking NATO officials were aboard for a classified diplomatic mission. Catherine's presence wasn't coincidental. She had been placed on the flight as a covert security backup, a precaution that her former colleagues hoped would never be needed. Her apparent disinterest in her surroundings masked a constant state of tactical awareness. She made small notations in her day planner, observations about aircraft performance and crew behavior that looked like routine business notes to casual observers. She noticed when the captain coughed repeatedly during the pre-flight safety briefing. She observed the slight vibration in the left wing that suggested a minor hydraulic irregularity. She tracked the flight attendants' movements and identified the passengers who displayed the nervous tension of people carrying classified information. Most importantly, she had noted the subtle changes in the captain's breathing pattern and skin color that suggested cardiovascular stress, symptoms that concerned her more than the mechanical issues. "Ma'am, would you like another water?" asked a flight attendant, interrupting Catherine's observations. "Thank you," Catherine replied politely, her voice carrying just enough authority to discourage further conversation. The flight attendant moved on, but not before Catherine had assessed her level of training, her composure under pressure, and her potential usefulness in an emergency situation. An elderly woman sitting across the aisle had been watching Catherine with interest. Unlike the other passengers who found her cold and intimidating, the older woman recognized something familiar in Catherine's bearing. "You remind me of my late husband," the elderly woman said quietly. "He was Air Force. Had that same way of watching everything without appearing to watch anything." Catherine's expression softened slightly as she met the woman's eyes. "What did he fly?" "F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam. Said the best pilots were the ones who never stopped preparing for the worst." Catherine nodded respectfully. "Your husband was a wise man." The conversation was brief, but the elderly woman would later recall, "She seemed cold on the outside, but when that little boy started coughing, she quietly passed him tissues." There was kindness under all that control. As Flight 236 reached cruising altitude, Catherine continued her discreet monitoring of the crew and passengers, hoping that her concerns about the captain's health would prove unfounded. She had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, every skill she had learned during her military career would be tested in the most public way possible. The documents in her briefcase contained more than business contracts. They included emergency protocols and communication codes that she prayed would never need to be used. But Catherine had learned long ago that hope was a luxury that professionals couldn't afford. Preparation was the only insurance policy that mattered when lives were on the line. Flight 236 was about to test that philosophy in the most dramatic way possible. 2.5 hours into the flight, Catherine's worst fears were realized when Captain Morrison suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed over the controls, his face gray with the unmistakable signs of cardiac arrest. The Boeing 777 immediately began an uncontrolled descent as the captain's weight pushed the control yoke forward, sending the aircraft into a shallow dive that would become deadly within minutes. In the cockpit, First Officer Janet Chen fought to regain control while simultaneously trying to revive the unconscious captain. But her training hadn't prepared her for flying a wide-body aircraft single-handed while performing CPR. "Mayday! Mayday!" she transmitted over the radio. "This is Flight 236. Captain is unconscious. I need immediate assistance." Word of the crisis spread through the cabin like wildfire. The captain collapsed. Nobody knows how to fly the plane. Panic erupted throughout the aircraft as passengers realized their situation. Children began crying, adults prayed frantically, and the flight attendants struggled to maintain order while dealing with their own terror. Catherine removed her blazer and stood up, moving toward the cockpit with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she knew exactly where she was going and why. A flight attendant blocked her path, professional training overriding panic. "Ma'am, please return to your seat." Passengers aren't allowed in the cockpit. A male passenger nearby shouted over the chaos, "Let the men handle this." "This isn't a job for women," Catherine said nothing, simply removing her expensive watch and placing it carefully in her pocket, the gesture of someone preparing for work that required complete focus and precision. She gently but firmly moved past the flight attendant and entered the cockpit, where First Officer Chen was hyperventilating while trying to stabilize the aircraft and communicate with air traffic control simultaneously. The radio crackled with urgent transmissions. "Flight 236, this is F-22 escort. We need you to identify your call sign immediately. Unknown aircraft in restricted airspace will be treated as hostile." First Officer Chen's voice broke with stress. "We don't have a call sign. Our captain is down. I don't know the protocols." Catherine settled into the captain's seat with fluid movements that spoke of thousands of hours of experience, her hands moving across the controls with the automatic precision of someone who had been born to fly. She keyed the microphone and transmitted with calm, professional authority. "Falcon One, checking in for Flight 236. The radio went completely silent for several heartbeats. Then the F-22 pilot's voice came through, filled with disbelief. "Falcon One, are you confirming Black Dawn authorization?" First Officer Chen stared at Catherine in amazement. "My God, and who are you?" Catherine's response was brief and focused. "Maintain current heading. I'll handle communications and navigation." Word spread through the cabin faster than the flight attendants could control it. Falcon One was apparently a legendary call sign, something that made even military pilots snap to attention. The passengers who had mocked Catherine's gender and questioned her capabilities now sat in stunned silence, beginning to understand that they had drastically underestimated the quiet woman in business class. Through the aircraft's intercom system, Catherine's voice reached every passenger. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your temporary flight commander. We have the situation under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and follow all instructions from the cabin crew." There was something in her tone, calm authority backed by absolute competence, that immediately reduced the panic level throughout the aircraft. A young flight attendant who had been on the verge of hysteria found herself calmed by Catherine's steady presence. "I was shaking so badly I couldn't function." She just put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Good job." That's all it took. I felt like I could handle anything. In the cockpit, Catherine began coordinating with the F-22 escorts while simultaneously teaching First Officer Chen advanced techniques for flying a damaged aircraft with reduced crew. "F-22 flight, this is Falcon One. I need a clear approach corridor to the nearest suitable airport. We have medical emergency aboard and reduced flight crew capability." The military pilot's response was immediate. "Falcon One, we have the approach cleared. Welcome back to active operations. Catherine hadn't used her military call sign in 7 years, but it felt as natural as breathing. The skills she had thought were retired forever came flooding back with crystal clarity. First Officer Chen, you're doing excellent work, she said calmly. I need you to monitor our altitude and airspeed while I handle navigation and radio communications. We're going to bring everyone home safely. The professionalism and competence she displayed transformed the cockpit from a place of chaos into a center of controlled, purposeful activity. Through the passenger windows, they could see the F-22 escorts maintaining perfect formation, their presence a reminder that Catherine commanded respect from some of the most elite pilots in the world. An investment banker, who had earlier dismissed her as just another corporate ice queen, whispered to his seatmate, "She's not cold. She's focused. There's a difference." The businessman who had shouted about letting men handle this now sat quietly, his earlier arrogance replaced by grudging respect for someone who was demonstrating capabilities he could never hope to match. Catherine's calm competence was contagious, spreading throughout the aircraft as passengers began to believe that they might actually survive their ordeal. But the real test was still ahead. Landing a wide-body commercial aircraft with a reduced crew, a medical emergency, and the eyes of the aviation world watching every move. Catherine had handled worse situations during her military career, but never with 200 civilian lives depending on her performance. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option. Word of Falcon One being active on civilian frequencies spread through military communication networks with the speed that only comes from hearing ghost stories come to life. Senior officers in the Pentagon, NORAD command centers, and NATO headquarters suddenly found themselves dealing with a situation that officially couldn't be happening. A pilot with the highest security clearances was conducting emergency operations on a commercial aircraft. The F-22 flight leader changed his entire radio protocol. "Falcon One, what are your orders?" Catherine's response carried the quiet authority that had made her legendary during classified operations. "Maintain loose trail formation. Hold current altitude. I'll advise when we need approach support." In the passenger cabin, a corporate executive who had earlier mocked her presence began shouting, "If you're so good, then land this plane." "Prove it." Catherine didn't respond verbally. Instead, she activated the aircraft's navigation lights in a specific Morse code pattern. Silence. Every radar facility and military installation monitoring the flight immediately recognized the Black Dawn authentication code, a signal that hadn't been used since classified operations that officially didn't exist. The message was clear to anyone with the appropriate clearance. Falcon One was in command, and interference would not be tolerated. The F-22 pilot's voice came through the radio with newfound respect. "We copy, Falcon One. You have full command authority." In the cabin, passengers fell completely silent. Those who had laughed at her now bowed their heads, afraid to meet her eyes or question her authority. Catherine began issuing crisp, professional instructions to First Officer Chen. Reduce throttle to 82%. Begin descent to flight level 250. We're going to execute a modified approach to account for the crosswind. Her decision-making process was flawless, analyzing weather conditions, runway length, aircraft weight, and crew capabilities to select the safest possible landing option. The aircraft shuddered slightly as they encountered turbulence, but Catherine's hands remained steady on the controls, making micro-adjustments with the precision of someone who had landed aircraft in far worse conditions. "First Officer, you're doing excellent work," she said encouragingly. "Monitor our airspeed and call out altitude markers. I need you to be my eyes on the instruments while I handle the approach." The collaboration between the two pilots was seamless, with Catherine's experience compensating for Chen's nervousness and Chen's fresh training providing backup awareness for Catherine's tactical focus. Throughout the cabin, passengers who had been screaming in terror now watched in silent fascination as someone they had dismissed as an uptight businesswoman demonstrated skills that belonged in action movies rather than commercial aviation. "Look at her hands," whispered one passenger. "She's flying this thing like it weighs nothing. The way she talks to those fighter jets, she's not just a pilot. She's something else entirely." Catherine opened her microphone for a general announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach. Please ensure your seats are in the upright position, seatbelts are securely fastened, and all carry-on items are stowed. We'll be on the ground in 12 minutes. Her voice carried across the cabin with calm confidence that made everyone believe her promise, despite the gravity of their situation. The F-22 escorts moved into approach formation, creating a corridor of safety around the commercial airliner as it descended toward the airport. Falcon One, this is Tower Control. You're cleared for emergency landing runway 27L. All emergency services are standing by. Catherine began her landing callouts with the mechanical precision that separates professional aviators from everyone else. 1,000 feet, stable approach. 500 feet, minimums confirmed. 200 feet, runway in sight, landing. The Boeing 777 touched down with barely a bump. Catherine's throttle and control input so smooth that passengers barely felt the transition from flight to ground operations. As the aircraft rolled down the runway, the F-22 escorts executed a ceremonial flyby, their wings tilted in the traditional aviator's salute to acknowledge superior airmanship. "Ma'am," came the F-22 pilot's final transmission, "welcome back to the sky." The tower controller's voice carried admiration that transcended professional protocol. "Falcon One, that was textbook perfect. Outstanding airmanship." In the cabin, the silence was profound. No one applauded. The moment felt too significant for casual celebration. Instead, passengers watched with something approaching reverence as Catherine completed her post-landing checklist with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the crisis. First Officer Chen, who had been on the verge of panic just an hour earlier, looked at Catherine with undisguised admiration. "I've never seen anyone fly like that. You made it look easy." Catherine's response was characteristically understated. "You did the hard part. Single pilot operations require trust between crew members. You gave me that trust." But the most significant moment came when Catherine stood to leave the cockpit and found herself facing the passengers who had mocked her earlier. The businessman who had shouted about letting men handle this now stood with his head bowed in shame. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." "And my life." Catherine looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the flight. "You don't owe me anything. Just remember that competence doesn't announce itself. It simply performs when called upon." A young woman traveling with her infant daughter approached with tears in her eyes. "You saved my baby's life. How can I ever thank you?" "Raise her to judge people by their actions, not their assumptions," Catherine replied quietly. As emergency medical personnel boarded to tend to the recovering captain, passengers began to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just exceptional flying skills, but a demonstration of grace under pressure that transcended gender, expectations, and preconceived notions. The corporate executive who had demanded she prove it was now writing a public apology on social media. "Today I learned that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about quiet competence. I was wrong about everything." Catherine gathered her blazer and prepared to leave the aircraft, but not before checking on each crew member and ensuring that all passengers were safely accounted for. A flight attendant who had been ready to quit her job due to the trauma of the emergency found herself inspired instead. "She showed me that real leadership isn't about making noise. It's about making things work when they're falling apart." As Catherine walked toward the exit, the passengers naturally formed an informal honor guard, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect for someone who had just saved their lives with nothing more than skill, preparation, and the kind of quiet courage that needs no fanfare. The story would spread across aviation networks within hours, but for now it belonged to the 200 people who had learned that heroes often wear business suits and prefer actions to words. Falcon One was about to disappear back into anonymity, leaving behind only the memory of perfect airmanship and a lesson in never judging a book by its cover. As Flight 236 came to a complete stop at the gate, an unusual silence filled the cabin. Instead of the typical applause that follows a difficult landing, passengers sat in respectful quiet, watching as Catherine Hale calmly gathered her belongings and straightened her gray blazer. She walked down the aircraft aisle with the same composed dignity she had shown throughout the crisis, her blonde hair catching the gate lighting as she prepared to disappear back into the anonymous crowd of business travelers. The F-22 pilots who had escorted the flight landed at a nearby military facility and immediately removed their helmets in salute, a gesture of respect that would be photographed and shared throughout aviation communities worldwide. Passengers filed off the aircraft in uncharacteristic silence, many of them stealing glances at Catherine as she moved through the terminal like any other business traveler, her extraordinary capabilities hidden beneath an unremarkable exterior. Word spread quickly through social media and aviation networks. Falcon One has returned to active operations. Military bases around the world began displaying the radar image of Catherine's Morse code message, silence, as a training example of how real authority communicates through competence rather than volume. A young flight attendant who had been on duty during the crisis wrote in her personal journal, "Today I learned that silence can be the most powerful form of communication." She never raised her voice, never demanded attention, but when she spoke, the entire aviation world listened. The businessman who had mocked Catherine's gender and capabilities during the crisis spent the evening writing a public letter that would go viral within days. "I spent today learning that my prejudices almost cost me my life. I assumed a woman couldn't handle an aviation emergency. I was wrong about everything that matters." Catherine's perfect landing became the subject of analysis at flight schools around the world, not just for its technical precision, but for the way she had maintained crew coordination under extreme pressure. Aviation safety investigators would later note that her decision-making process had eliminated every potential point of failure, turning a catastrophic situation into a routine emergency landing through superior preparation and execution. The corporate executive who had demanded she prove it found himself featured in business magazines discussing the dangers of leadership assumptions. The most effective leaders aren't the ones who make the most noise. They're the ones who deliver results when everything else fails. Social media exploded with #FalconStans as passengers shared their experiences. But the most powerful testimonies came from the flight crew who had worked with Catherine directly. First Officer Chen gave an interview that would be required viewing at aviation academies. "She didn't just save our aircraft. She taught me what real command presence looks like. Authority that comes from competence, not hierarchy." The elderly woman who had recognized Catherine's military bearing became an unexpected celebrity, appearing on news programs to discuss the importance of not judging people by their appearance. "I knew she reminded me of my husband, that quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever comes next." Military aviation museums began requesting artifacts from Flight 236, though Catherine had left nothing behind except the memory of extraordinary airmanship and the lesson that heroism often wears civilian clothes. The most significant impact was cultural. Aviation training programs began emphasizing that emergency competence could come from unexpected sources, that the most qualified person in a crisis might not be the one with the highest rank or the loudest voice. Catherine's example inspired changes in how airlines trained their crews to recognize and utilize passenger expertise during emergencies, acknowledging that commercial flights often carried highly qualified individuals whose skills might prove crucial in crisis situations. Flight attendants reported increased respect for passengers who demonstrated quiet competence, understanding that appearance and assumptions could mask extraordinary capabilities. The story became a case study in business schools about the dangers of stereotyping and the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its packaging. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the passengers themselves. 200 people who would spend the rest of their lives remembering the day they learned that heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just show up, do what needs to be done, and quietly return to their lives. Comment Falcon Stands. If you believe the sharpest pilots never speak loud, only clear. Catherine Hale walked through the airport terminal and disappeared into the crowd of travelers, declining every interview request and avoiding every camera that tried to capture her story. She needed no recognition, no stage, no spotlight. She had simply delivered what was required. A complete flight with all souls aboard safely returned to their families. The story spread through aviation circles and social media, but Catherine had already moved on to her next consulting assignment, carrying only the satisfaction of a job well done. The lessons she left behind would reshape how people thought about competence, authority, and the dangerous assumptions we make about those around us. Silence isn't weakness. Silence is strength used at the right moment, by the right person, for the right purpose. Falcon One didn't need to shout or demand attention. A single perfect landing had silenced every critic and proven every point that needed proving. The passengers of Flight 236 would tell the story for the rest of their lives. She spoke only once, and the entire world stopped to listen. Aviation schools began teaching her approach as the gold standard for emergency crew resource management. Calm communication, clear delegation, and absolute focus on results rather than recognition. Military academies studied her radio transmissions as examples of how real authority communicates. Not through volume or aggression, but through competence so clear that it requires no explanation. The businessman who had dismissed her capabilities became an advocate for recognizing talent regardless of gender or appearance, speaking at conferences about the cost of unconscious bias in emergency situations. Young pilots, both male and female, began studying Catherine's techniques not just for the flying skills, but for the leadership principles she had demonstrated under extreme pressure. Flight attendants reported that the story had changed how they interacted with passengers, leading them to look beyond surface appearances to identify individuals who might have valuable skills in crisis situations. Corporate training programs began using Flight 236 as a case study in recognizing and utilizing hidden talent within organizations, acknowledging that expertise often comes in unexpected packages. The elderly woman who had recognized Catherine's military bearing became a sought-after speaker on the topic of looking beyond appearances. The most dangerous people to underestimate are the quiet ones who know exactly what they're doing. Years later, when commercial aircraft encountered difficulties, air traffic controllers would sometimes report hearing a calm female voice on emergency frequencies offering technical guidance before fading back into silence. The phenomenon became known among aviation professionals as Falcon's frequency, the mysterious appearance of expert help during the worst crises, followed by disappearance back into anonymity. But Catherine continued her quiet life as a civilian consultant, traveling between assignments and maintaining the low profile she had cultivated since leaving military service. She kept her commendations in a drawer, preferring to wear the simple mechanical watch that had survived multiple aircraft crashes and emergency landings, the only outward sign of a life spent in service to others. A maintenance technician at the airport where Flight 236 had landed found a note tucked into the cockpit after Catherine had left, written in precise handwriting. For the next pilot who sits here, remember that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most competent. Real authority whispers. The note became part of the airport's permanent collection, a reminder that heroism often comes disguised as ordinary professionalism. Catherine had proven that the most effective leaders are often those who speak softly, but carry themselves with the unmistakable confidence that comes from knowing they can deliver when everything else fails. The story of Flight 236 became more than just an aviation legend. It became a reminder that we are surrounded by extraordinary people living ordinary lives, waiting for the moment when their skills are needed to save the day. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to SN Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.